Fundamentally, your duty as a banker is to know who you're dealing with. And if you don't, then you risk riding with the devil, and that's what Alna Bank did.
Who's in charge of it all?
Shell company, shell company, shell company, shell company, holding company, another shell company, another shell company. The company at the bottom of the charts owns the one that's supposedly at the top.
Who's giving the orders in there?
What politician will disclose his interest? Yes, I award contract to my family. Yes, I approve license in return for profit share. Yes, I sit on the board that approve bribe payment to the colleague in the ministry.
We need to know. We need to know.
A few corrupt politicians here, a bit of tax evasion there, even money laundering. I mean, okay, we can deal with it. But when someone mentions the words terrorism and proliferation, blood runs cold.
I would remind you, we are talking about people and outcomes so terrifying, their merest shadows would send you screaming into the nearest mental institution.
Long before the crisis which engulfed it in the middle of the second decade of the 21st century, Alna Bank, one of the largest and most prestigious financial institutions in the world, had suffered heavily in the great financial crisis of 2008-9. Forced to take government bailout money to plug massive losses in its investment banking division, the 100-year-old bank set about sorting out its problems and regaining its independence.
Well, I think, as with a lot of other financial institutions at that time, who were in a similar position, there was a great focus on never again. But it was all on market risk, transaction risk, systemic exposure, the bonus and reward structure. I don't recall money laundering being much above radar at that time. In fact, we were trying to rebuild the business. There was very much a focus on revenue generation again.
At the forefront of the bank's effort to grow its revenues and rebuild its balance sheet was the Global Relationships Division, or GRD. Founded on Alna Bank's successful asset management business, by 2014, GRD had grown into one of its most profitable business units, which saw business growth double between 2010 and 2013, through a potent combination of aggressive cross-selling of the bank's wholesale and retail products, a fierce commitment to client satisfaction, and to meeting and exceeding business targets.
The feeding zone for the GRD guys was, you've got an investment manager for a pension fund who can introduce you to a board director at one of the investee corporations, who can feed you investment banking business, at the same time introducing you to a lot of private wealth management opportunities in amongst the senior management of the company, cherry-picking the best business in the bank. Very aggressive sales practices. I would say they were not that popular, though, because it was always, how much did you make last year?
As the financial crisis eased, as growth returned and banks like Alna started to grow their revenues again, there was another reason why money laundering risk had a lowered profile within the organisation. It concerned the very way in which anti-money laundering was managed in the bank. It was called the risk-based approach.
Well, the best analogy for the risk-based approach that I could give would be that of driving a motor vehicle. Now, if conditions are sunny and clear, if the road is straight and well known to you, well, you just probably grab your keys and go. And you go as fast as you're allowed to when you're driving. In other words, you drive appropriately for the level of risk which you perceive. But if it's raining, if it's dark, if the road has lots of obstacles and dangers and you don't know it that well, then you prepare more thoroughly and you take more care about what you're doing. You drive more slowly and more cautiously. Now, applying that to a bank like Alna Bank, whenever it took on a customer, it was required to assess that customer's risk profile according to a predefined set of criteria. the country of residence, what type of business they were in, the types and sizes of the transactions they were likely to undertake. And then to assign a risk rating to that customer, now either high, medium or low, which in turn would determine the extent of the due diligence, that is, the background research and documentation which would be undertaken against the client before the account was opened. And also the degree of monitoring of that account for suspicious activity once it was opened. Normal due diligence and monitoring for low-risk customers, and enhanced due diligence and monitoring for high-risk customers.
Alna Bank's customer due diligence policy contained detailed requirements on how clients should be categorised and what documents and background checks should be obtained and made. Early on in the process, the bank decided that the customer-facing relationship managers in divisions such as GRD needed assistance with the process, and so the Business Unit Support Group, or BUS, was formed. The idea being that hard-pressed relationship managers focused on bringing new business into the bank would be able to call upon the unit for support and assistance. But what developed in practice was a disconnect between business acquisition and business risk assessment, which started to cause problems.
To me, it took what should be more of an art and tried to turn it into science. Now, instead of having to answer to just one simple question, namely, what is the risk that this potential client could be a money launderer or could pose reputational risk to the bank, now instead we are filling in this form, that form, a matrix, 20, 30, 100 questions. They, who have no revenue target or responsibility, are telling you, well, we need the business plan. We need evidence that he sold his company 7 years ago. We need to see the certificate of incorporation of 20 subsidiaries in different countries. If I tell you, one of the things they developed was a new system. It cost tens of millions of dollars to capture all of the information about every new customer, to screen them against the blacklist, to anticipate the activity on the account. This was an amazing contraption, which I'm sure they all loved very dearly. And it was called the NCA, the New Customer Acceptance System. But already it was known by us on the first day in relationship management as NCA, no clients anymore.
Against this background of global financial recovery, aggressive revenue growth, and a new risk assessment system, in April 2014, the asset management team at GRD in Alna Bank was approached by a Cypriot investment firm, J. DeLea Investments, with a proposal to place €1 billion under management, with more to follow if investment targets were met. The amount was significant enough to trigger interest, and initial due diligence against DeLea revealed that, although small, it was properly constituted and regulated in Cyprus, a member state of the European Union, and had been in existence for 20 years, with no adverse publicity. The issue at question now was, where had the money come from? Or more precisely, did Alna even need to ask that question?
The relationship management people are aware that under Alna Bank's own AML policy, because DeLea is incorporated and regulated in an EU country, it's entitled to be designated as low risk. They also know that under the applicable international standards that where a financial institution such as DeLea is in an equivalent jurisdiction, which Cyprus is, then the bank is entitled to rely on the due diligence done by its own client, as long as they, i.e. DeLea Investments, agree to it. Easy. We don't have to do our own due diligence. On the other hand, the BUS people instinctively want to take it further. And they know that the ultimate responsibility for meeting those requirements still remains with Alna Bank. They also know that places like Cyprus and Malta received heavy inflows of money from Russia and other countries of the former Soviet Union during the 1990s, of who knows what origin. So they're saying, we need to look behind DeLea and see what's there.
These divisions between the Global Relationships Division and the Business Unit Support Group now surfaced at a more senior level in the form of an email exchange between Daniel Johnson, the Group Executive Director responsible for the GRD, and Ottilie Marks, the group head of compliance. In an email dated 4th April, Johnson wrote, "Whilst I understand the requirement for a 360-degree assessment of all relationships, and am in no way suggesting a blind application of the policy framework, nevertheless I do not understand BUS's apparent zeal for undertaking such an extensive additional due diligence burden, in circumstances where both law and policy permit us to rely on the word of a regulated financial intermediary inside an EU member state." To which Marks replied on 5th April,
"The fact that the policy or the law permits us to take a certain approach does not mean that we should always do so. It is clear that the ultimate responsibility for due diligence remains with us, and given the jurisdiction and its reputation for the receipt of funds from high-risk locations, and also given the absence of an international reputation in the firm in question, my view is that we need to dig deeper into the source of funds, and, where necessary, conduct due diligence against the beneficial owners."
Perhaps surprisingly, given its operational rather than strategic nature, the issue apparently moved to the Management Committee, where it took shape as a wider debate about the bank's approach to due diligence and the attitudes expected of its business initiation and business control functions. It fell to Group Chief Executive Greg Jonas to make the final call, and he sided with Marks. But the support appeared to come at a price. In his email to Johnson and Marks dated 17th May, he wrote, "As decided at Mancom, we will make the further inquiries which you, Ottilie, recommend. Indeed, we should always ensure that our anti-money laundering procedures are capable of withstanding the sternest scrutiny." But then he continued, "Nevertheless, my job is to see that both the business acquisition and business control units within the bank are pulling together, understanding each other's positions and supporting each other, and I am not convinced that this is happening. We have demanding targets to meet going forward in the next 2 financial years, which will only be met if we work as a team. Please note for the future."
Well, the BUS team gets hold of the Delea records, and then there's good news and bad news. The bad news is that Delea's client is indeed one of a group of companies headquartered in the former Soviet Republic of Moldavia, the Xavier Group. The good news is that there are some records, There were copies of corporate certificates on the file, information from local newspapers about business activities of the group, and the names and passport copies of the directors of the different companies, etc., etc.
Talk about complex structures. Shell company, shell company, shell company, shell company, holding company, another shell company, another shell company. The company at the bottom of the charts owns the one that's supposedly at the top. And you have to ask yourself, when you see a structure like that, what is the reason for that structure? And is it there basically to disguise beneficial ownership?
Complex arrangements and complex structures are not in themselves evidence of wrongdoing. Any program of acquisitions without any corporate restructuring will result in a complex structure. In countries suffering from high levels of official corruption, complex structures are used by the owners of businesses to disguise the extent of their wealth to avoid demands and threats. But of course, complex structures work equally well as a way of disguising illicitly gained wealth. The key point is that, regardless of the structure and its complexity, you need to know who is the beneficial owner of the wealth represented in that structure. Because if you don't know who the beneficial owner is, then how can you tell me that it isn't Joaquin Guzman or Osama bin Laden?